what if the story of humanity never began beneath the open sky, but deep inside the earth? Imagine a world where the first fires were lit not under constellations, but beneath ceilings of stone, where rivers of lightless water carved the paths of survival, and where our ancestors looked not upward to the stars, but inward to the endless caverns of the underworld. For centuries, myths have whispered of hidden realms below our feet, kingdoms of shadows, secret cities, and forgotten civilizations. But what if these were not just stories? What if the first chapter of human history unfolded not on the surface, close your but within eyes for a moment and imagine the very first breath of humanity? But not as you might expect it, not under the vast open sky with sunlight warming newborn faces, but instead in the cool, embracing darkness of the earth itself, where silence holds secrets and shadows cradle the beginning of all we have become. What if our story begins not with light, but with the gentle, eternal darkness that lies beneath our feet? What if the first human voices echoed not across plains and valleys, but through the hidden chambers and forgotten corridors of a world that exists below our world, where life first learned to whisper its intentions into being? Tonight we descend together into this possibility, but in the quiet sanctuaries carved by time itself into the very bones of the earth. And if you find yourself drawn to this journey of discovery, to these whispered possibilities that challenge everything we thought we knew about our beginnings, then settle in as we explore the shadows that may hold the truth of who we truly are. The earth beneath us is not merely solid ground upon which we build our lives. It is a vast, breathing network of chambers and passages, caverns that stretch beyond imagination, holding within their walls the potential for life to flourish in ways we are only beginning to understand. For in the absence of light, life does not cease to exist, but rather transforms, adapts, and perhaps even begins. Picture yourself standing at the entrance to a cavern so vast that your voice, when called into its depths, returns to you changed, carrying with it the whispers of ages that have passed in the darkness below. The air that flows from these depths is not stale or lifeless, but rich with the breath of hidden ecosystems, carrying scents of minerals and moisture that speak of water flowing through passages, carved by patience itself over millions of years. This is not the underworld of punishment that later religions would imagine, not the realm of the dead or the damned, but rather the original sanctuary, the first home, the womb from which consciousness itself may have emerged. For what if the question we should be asking is not how humanity climbed from darkness into light, but rather how we learned to carry the wisdom of darkness with us, as we eventually ventured into the blazing uncertainty of the surface world? Consider the profound intimacy of cave dwelling, where every sound carries meaning, where the quality of air tells stories about weather patterns on the surface far above, where the subtle changes in temperature speak of seasons that affect the deep places in ways completely different from their effects on the world of sun and wind. In such an environment, human consciousness would have developed not the broad, sweeping awareness suited to scanning horizons for danger or opportunity, but rather the deep, penetrating awareness that can read the subtle signs of an environment, where survival depends on understanding the most delicate fluctuations in conditions that remain largely stable for centuries at a time. Perhaps this is why so many of our meditation traditions speak of going inward, of descending into the depths of consciousness, where the true self can be found. Perhaps these are not merely metaphorical descriptions, but rather genetic memories of a time when going inward meant literally descending into the physical depths where our ancestors learned the fundamental skills of inner navigation that we still carry within our neural architecture today. The darkness of the underground is not an absence, but a presence, not an emptiness, but a fullness that contains possibilities invisible to eyes trained only for surface light. In the gentle, consistent darkness of deep caves, other senses become primary. Other ways of knowing become essential. And perhaps other forms of intelligence emerged that we have only begun to rediscover through practices like meditation, deep listening, and the cultivation of intuitive awareness that seems to arise most readily when we remove ourselves from the constant stimulation of surface existence. Imagine the first human communities that may have developed in these depths, learning to read the messages carried by underground rivers, developing technologies based not on manipulating sunlight and surface materials, but on understanding the deeper rhythms of geological processes, the patterns of mineral formation, the ways that underground ecosystems maintain themselves through forms of circulation and exchange that operate on timescales far longer than anything we experience in our current surface-based existence. These communities would have developed forms of art and music specifically adapted to cave acoustics, where sound becomes not just communication but sculpture, where the human voice learns to work with the natural reverberations of stone chambers to create experiences of beauty and meaning that could never be replicated in the open air. Perhaps this is why we still find ourselves moved by the sound of voices in cathedrals and other enclosed spaces that echo the acoustic properties of the original caverns, where human creativity first learned to express the inexpressible through organized sound. As we allow ourselves to sink deeper into this contemplation, we begin to sense how the underground realm might have served not just as physical shelter, but as the original laboratory for consciousness itself, the place where awareness first learned to function independently of external light sources, where the human mind developed its capacity for creating internal illumination through imagination, memory, and the systematic exploration of inner landscapes that mirror and perhaps even surpass the complexity of any surface geography. The myths that have emerged from cultures across the globe speak with remarkable consistency of humanity's emergence from underground realms, and these stories carry within them details that suggest not mere symbolic meaning, but preserved memories of actual experiences, passed down through countless generations until they crystallized into the foundational narratives that continue to shape how we understand our place in the cosmos. The Hopi people of the American Southwest speak of climbing through successive worlds beneath the surface, each realm teaching different lessons, each level of ascent requiring new forms of wisdom and capability. They describe not a single emergence, but a gradual process of learning to inhabit multiple levels of reality simultaneously, with the surface world representing not escape from the depths, but rather integration of all the wisdom gained during the long journey upward through increasingly complex forms of existence. In their telling, the emergence was not an abandonment of the lower worlds, but rather a graduation, a moment when the beings who had learned all that the depths could teach were finally ready to apply that knowledge in the more challenging environment of surface existence. And they emphasized that the connection to the lower worlds was never severed, that the passages between levels remain open for those who know how to find them, and who have prepared themselves to navigate the different forms of consciousness required. For travel between realms, the ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of the Anunnaki, beings who moved freely between surface and depth, who possessed technologies that seemed magical to surface dwellers, but which may have been simply the natural result of civilizations that had learned to work with the different physical laws that operate in underground environments. These stories describe not gods visiting from the sky, but rather beings emerging from depths, bringing with them knowledge systems based on understanding geological processes, underground water systems, and the forms of agriculture and architecture that work in harmony with subsurface conditions. The Greek myths of Hades reveal a sophisticated understanding of the underworld, not as a place of punishment, but as a complex ecosystem with its own rivers, its own forms of life, its own kings and queens and social structures. Persephone's journey represents not a kidnapping, but an initiation, a necessary descent into the depths where certain forms of wisdom can only be acquired, followed by a return to the surface that brings with it the gifts that can only be obtained through direct experience of the underground realm. The Hindu cosmology speaks of Patala as one of 7 lower realms, not beneath the earth in a punitive sense, but simply deeper, representing different levels of consciousness and different approaches to existence. The beings who inhabit these realms are not demons or punished souls, but rather forms of intelligence that have specialized in understanding the particular qualities and possibilities available at each level of depth, each realm offering unique perspectives on the nature of reality that can only be gained through sustained residence in those specific conditions. The Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories speak of the ancestral beings who traveled through underground passages that connected distant locations on the surface, creating a network of sacred sites that are understood not as separate places, but as points of emergence from a continuous underground realm that underlies and supports all surface geography. These passages are described not as empty tunnels, but as living pathways filled with the ongoing presence of the creative forces that continue to maintain the connection between different aspects of the landscape and different levels of existence. The Celtic myths speak of the otherworld that can be accessed through caves, wells, and other openings in the earth, realms where time moves differently and where forms of knowledge are available that cannot be acquired through surface experience alone. These stories describe not supernatural realms, but rather natural extensions of ordinary reality, suggesting that the early Celtic peoples maintained awareness of underground ecosystems and possibly underground human communities that operated according to different principles than surface societies. What emerges from this global pattern of emergence? Myths is not a collection of primitive fantasies, but rather a sophisticated understanding of multi-level existence, of reality as a series of interconnected realms, each offering different possibilities for consciousness and culture. These stories suggest that our ancestors did not simply imagine underground worlds, but rather lived in them, learned from them, and eventually emerged from them carrying knowledge that could only have been acquired through direct, sustained experience of subsurface existence. The consistency of these narratives across cultures that had no contact with each other points toward a common source, a shared memory of actual conditions that shaped human development in ways we are only beginning to understand. Perhaps what we call mythology is actually humanity's most ancient form of historical record, preserving information about our true origins in the only form that could survive the countless generations of transmission required to carry such knowledge. From the depths of time into our current era of surface-based civilization, as we allow these mythological visions to guide us deeper into contemplation of underground origins, we begin to see how such narratives might preserve not only memories of where we came from, but also blueprints for where we might be going, maps of possibilities that remain available to us if we can learn to read the signs that point toward the continuing presence of underground realms where different forms of human potential wait to be explored and integrated into our understanding of what it means to be fully human. The science of life in extreme environments reveals possibilities that stretch far beyond what we once believed necessary for the emergence and sustenance of complex organisms. In the deepest ocean trenches, where pressure would crush any surface-adapted life forms, and where no sunlight has ever penetrated, thriving ecosystems demonstrate that life can organize itself around completely different energy sources and environmental conditions than those we experience in surface habitats. Chemosynthetic bacteria form the foundation of these deep-sea communities, drawing energy not from photosynthesis, but from the chemical reactions that occur when mineral-rich water emerges from volcanic vents on the ocean floor. These organisms have learned to read the chemistry of their environment with such sophistication that they can extract sustenance from conditions that would be toxic to most surface life, transforming what appears hostile into the basis for complex food webs that support creatures of remarkable beauty and adaptability. In the caves of Romania, isolated from surface contact for over 5 million years, scientists have discovered ecosystems that operate entirely independently of any input from the world above. These cave systems contain not just simple bacteria, but complex organisms, including spiders, water, scorpions, and other creatures that have evolved in complete darkness, developing sensory capabilities that far exceed anything found in species, navigating their environment through forms of perception that we are only beginning to understand. The extremophiles found in caves throughout the world demonstrate forms of metabolism that can extract energy from pure rock, breaking down mineral compounds through processes that were previously thought impossible. These organisms suggest that life can establish itself and flourish in any environment where the basic chemical building blocks are available, regardless of temperature, pressure, acidity, or the presence or absence of traditional energy sources, like sunlight. Perhaps most remarkably, these cave ecosystems often display levels of cooperation and interconnection that exceed what we observe in surface environments. The lack of abundant resources requires forms of efficiency and mutual support that result in communities where waste from one organism becomes essential nutrition for another. where every element of the environment is utilized in cycles of exchange that demonstrate sustainability. Principles far more sophisticated than anything we have achieved in our surface-based industrial systems. If such complex ecosystems can develop and maintain themselves in caves, operating entirely independently of surface conditions, then the possibility that early human communities could have established themselves in similar environments becomes not just plausible, but almost inevitable. The advantages of cave dwelling during periods of surface instability would have been enormous, providing consistent temperature, protection from storms and climate fluctuations, access to underground water sources, and the possibility of developing agricultural and technological systems adapted to the unique conditions and opportunities available in subsurface environments. The human body itself contains numerous adaptations that make more sense if we evolved in low-light conditions rather than in the bright surface environments typically assumed in conventional evolutionary models. Our exceptional night vision, compared to most diurnal mammals, our ability to navigate in darkness using hearing and touch, our tendency to find enclosed, womb-like spaces comforting and conducive to deep rest and creative thinking all suggest that we spent significant portions of our evolutionary development in environments where such capabilities provided survival advantages. The human brain's remarkable ability to create detailed mental maps of complex three-dimensional spaces, to remember and navigate intricate routes through environments that lack obvious landmarks, to maintain social cohesion in conditions where visual contact is limited, all point toward evolutionary pressures that would have been far more relevant in cave systems than in the open landscapes typically assumed to be our ancestral environment. Perhaps what we call human intelligence first emerged not as an adaptation to hunting on the savanna, but as a response to the unique challenges and opportunities of underground existence. Our ancestors, who chose to explore and inhabit cave systems during periods of surface upheaval, would have discovered that these environments offer not just shelter, but entirely different possibilities for technological and cultural development. Working with stone becomes not just tool-making, but architecture when you are shaping the living rock that surrounds you. Agriculture becomes not just farming, but ecosystem management when you are working with the complex relationships between water, minerals, and the specialized life forms that thrive in cave conditions. The acoustic properties of caves would have encouraged forms of communication, music, and storytelling that take advantage of natural reverb and resonance, leading to traditions of oral culture that could preserve complex information across generations with a precision and beauty that purely certainties-based cultures might never have developed. Perhaps the profound human love for music and poetry emerges from these cave-dwelling ancestors, who learned to use sound not just for communication, but as a way of shaping their environment and strengthening the social bonds essential for survival. In conditions where individual autonomy was far less viable than it might be in surface environments, as we contemplate these biological possibilities, we begin to see how cave dwelling might have provided not just a refuge from surface catastrophes, but an opportunity for accelerated human development, an environment where the unique qualities of human consciousness could emerge and be refined under conditions that rewarded cooperation, innovation, and deep environmental awareness in ways that the more abundant surface world might not have demanded. Perhaps what we call civilization first developed not despite underground conditions, but because of them. As human communities learned to create beauty, meaning, and sustainable abundance in environments that required the highest levels of creativity and collaborative intelligence, the archaeological record whispers to us in fragments and shadows. But when we learn to read these whispers with imagination and openness, they tell stories of human habitation in underground spaces that stretch far deeper into time than conventional chronologies suggest. The painted caves of Lascaux and Altamira are not simply locations where pest-dwelling humans took temporary shelter and happened to create art, but rather sacred spaces that show evidence of sustained occupation and sophisticated cultural development over thousands of years. The paintings themselves reveal knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and ecological relationships that could only have been acquired through generations of careful observation and information sharing. But more than this, they demonstrate artistic techniques and aesthetic sensibilities that suggest these cave-dwelling communities had developed forms of culture that were not primitive, attempts to imitate surface civilizations, but rather sophisticated traditions adapted specifically to cave conditions and cave consciousness. The positioning of these paintings within the cave systems shows clear understanding of acoustic properties, air circulation patterns, and the psychological effects of different chambers and passages on human consciousness. The artists who created these works were not simply decorating available wall space, but rather designing total environmental experiences that used the natural properties of caves to create what we might now recognize as immersive multimedia installations combining visual art, acoustic design, and the choreography of movement through carefully planned sequences of spaces. The recent discovery of the Denisova cave in Siberia has revealed evidence of continuous human habitation spanning over 300,000 years, with artifacts and genetic material from multiple human species, including Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans. This suggests not just that caves provided temporary shelter during harsh periods, but that they served as long-term centers of human development, where different populations could survive, interact, and exchange knowledge across timescales that dwarf the entire recorded history of surface civilizations. The complexity of the tool traditions found in these deep cave sites indicates technological development that was not primitive, but rather highly specialized for cave conditions. These tools show understanding of acoustics for communication in echo-rich environments, sophisticated techniques for working stone in low-light conditions, and innovations for managing underground water sources, air quality, and the specialized forms of food production that would have been necessary for sustained underground communities. The burial practices found in caves throughout the world reveal that these spaces were understood not as temporary shelters, but as sacred environments where the connections between life and death, consciousness and matter, individual existence and cosmic processes could be explored and honored through ritual practices that seem designed specifically for underground conditions. These burial sites often show evidence of practices that continued for centuries or millennia, suggesting stable communities with sophisticated understanding of both practical and spiritual dimensions of underground existence. The alignment of many cave sites with astronomical phenomena visible from their entrances suggests that cave-dwelling communities maintained sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles, while developing their own underground-based systems for tracking time, seasons, and the larger rhythms that connect earthly existence with cosmic processes. This indicates not communities cut off from the larger world, but rather groups that had learned to synthesize surface and subsurface awareness into integrated understanding of reality as a multidimensional phenomenon. The widespread presence of underground water systems, storage chambers, and what appear to be agricultural terraces in cave complexes around the world points toward communities that had solved the fundamental challenges of sustainable underground living, developing technologies for food production, water management, and social organization that allowed them to thrive independently of surface conditions, while maintaining the option to emerge when surface conditions became favorable. The art, tools, and architectural modifications found in these sites reveal aesthetic sensibilities and cultural values that were not inferior to surface civilizations, but rather differently focused, emphasizing sustainability, cooperation, and deep environmental integration in ways that offer profound lessons for our current surface-based civilizations that are struggling with issues of resource depletion, social fragmentation, and environmental destruction. As we allow these archaeological whispers to guide our imagination, we begin to see the caves not as hiding places for primitive peoples, but as the original laboratories for advanced human civilization. The places where our ancestors learned to create sustainable abundance, meaningful beauty, and collaborative social structures that could maintain themselves across geological timescales, while preserving the knowledge and wisdom necessary for eventual reintegration with surface existence. The visions of hollow worlds that have captivated human imagination throughout recorded history emerge not from mere fantasy, but from something deeper, something that resonates with possibilities that our conscious minds have forgotten, but our unconscious minds continue to remember. These theories and legends persist across cultures and centuries, not because they are escapist dreams, but because they point toward realities that remain hidden beneath the surface of our current understanding. Edmund Halley, the brilliant astronomer whose mathematical precision enabled him to predict the return of the comet that bears his name, became convinced through his observations of magnetic phenomena and atmospheric lights that the Earth was hollow and inhabited, with aurora displays representing illumination, emanating from inner realms where different forms of life had developed their own sources of light and energy. His theory was not the speculation of a dreamer, but the carefully reasoned conclusion of a scientist who recognized that the phenomena he observed could not be adequately explained by models that assumed the Earth was solid throughout. John Cleves Sims, Jr., whose persistence and compelling presentations convinced the United States government to fund polar expeditions based on his theory that openings at the poles led to habitable inner worlds, drew his conclusions not from imagination but from careful analysis of wind patterns, ocean currents, and the behavior of migrating animals that seemed to disappear into polar regions and reappear with evidence of having accessed resources not available on the surface. His expedition proposals included detailed plans for the exploration and colonization of inner worlds that he believed offered solutions to problems of overpopulation and resource scarcity that were already beginning to concern surface civilizations. The legends of Agartha, that persist throughout Asian cultures describe not a mystical realm, but a sophisticated underground civilization with its own technologies, social systems, and forms of knowledge that have been developed over thousands of years in conditions that promote different forms of human potential than those that emerge in surface environments. These stories include detailed descriptions of transportation systems, communication networks, and forms of agriculture that suggest not fantasy but preserved memories of actual underground communities that may still exist in regions of the world where surface exploration has never penetrated. The persistent reports from explorers throughout history of discovering entrances to vast underground systems in remote regions of the Himalayas, the Amazon basin, the polar areas, and other locations that remain largely inaccessible to surface-based investigation form a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or delusion. These accounts often include descriptions of architectural features, atmospheric conditions, and encounters with beings who possess knowledge and capabilities that suggest long-term adaptation to underground conditions. The Shambhala legends preserved in Tibetan Buddhism describe not a supernatural realm, but a hidden valley or underground kingdom where advanced practitioners have preserved ancient wisdom traditions and developed technologies that work in harmony with natural systems in ways that surface civilizations have not achieved. These descriptions include practical details about sustainable energy systems, ecological agriculture, and social organization that suggest not religious mythology but information about alternative approaches to civilization that have been developed and tested under different environmental conditions. The persistence of these hollow earth visions across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests that they arise from some universal aspect of human consciousness, some deep memory or intuition that recognizes the underground realm not as alien territory, but as homeland, not as the realm of the dead or the damned, but as the source of life and wisdom that continues to call to us from beneath our feet. Perhaps these visions represent not escapist fantasies, but rather genetic memories of our actual origins, preserved in the form of stories and theories that point us toward possibilities that remain available, if we can develop the courage and wisdom necessary to explore them. The technologies described in these hollow earth accounts often focus on working with natural energy systems rather than against them, on forms of illumination that do not depend on burning fuel, on transportation that uses the Earth's own magnetic and gravitational fields, on agriculture that enhances rather than depletes soil systems. These descriptions may preserve knowledge of sustainable technologies that were developed by underground civilizations and that offer alternatives to the destructive industrial processes that characterize our current surface-based approach to meeting human needs. The social systems described in these inner world accounts typically emphasize cooperation, ecological integration, and forms of governance that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term individual advantage. These may represent not utopian fantasies, but rather practical solutions to problems of social organization that were developed by communities that could not afford the waste, conflict, and environmental destruction that surface abundance has allowed us to ignore until recently. As we allow ourselves to take these hollow world visions seriously, not as literal geographical claims, but as preserved information about alternative approaches to human civilization. We begin to see them as maps pointing toward possibilities that remain available to us. If we can learn to synthesize the wisdom of surface and subsurface existence into integrated approaches to technology, social organization, and ecological relationship that honor both the expansive possibilities of surface life and the sustainable, deeply rooted wisdom that can only be developed through intimate relationship with the depths throughout the great catastrophes that have shaped our planet's history, the underground has served as sanctuary, not just for individual survival, but for the preservation of knowledge, culture, and the seeds of civilizational renewal that allow life to flourish again when surface conditions stabilize. The geological record shows that periods of intense volcanic activity, cosmic impacts, and climate upheaval that devastated surface ecosystems were survived by life forms that had learned to inhabit the more stable conditions available in subsurface environments. The massive volcanic eruptions that occurred approximately 74,000 years ago, when Mount Toba's explosion created a volcanic winter that lasted for years and reduced global human populations to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals, could only have been survived by communities that had access to shelter, stored resources, and sustainable systems that could function independently of surface agriculture and the complex ecosystems that support hunting and gathering. The genetic bottleneck that this event created in human populations suggests that our current human family may descend from these underground survivors who possessed the knowledge and preparation necessary to endure catastrophic surface conditions. The ice ages that repeatedly transformed the Earth's surface over millions of years created conditions where surface survival would have required constant migration following retreating ice sheets and changing resource availability. But underground communities could have maintained stable populations in the geothermally heated cave systems that provided consistent temperatures, access to underground water sources, and the possibility of developing specialized forms of agriculture adapted to cave conditions. These communities would have served as genetic and cultural reservoirs that preserved human knowledge and adaptability. Through periods when surface conditions could not support complex civilizations, the impact events that periodically shower the Earth with cosmic debris, creating dust clouds that block sunlight for months or years at a time, would have made surface agriculture impossible and severely disrupted the food chains that support hunting and gathering. But underground communities, with stored food supplies and sustainable production systems, could have continued to thrive while surface life struggled to survive. The knowledge of how to read geological signs, predict seismic activity, and locate the most stable underground locations would have been essential survival skills that these communities would have developed and refined over generations. During these periods of subsurface refuge, human consciousness would have developed qualities that are difficult to cultivate in surface environments where individual mobility and resource acquisition provide alternatives to the deep cooperation and environmental sensitivity that cave dwelling requires. The extended periods of close social contact, the necessity of understanding complex three-dimensional navigation, the development of senses adapted to low light conditions, and the cultivation of patience and persistence required for underground Survival would have shaped human psychology in ways that continue to influence how we think, learn, and relate to each other. The agricultural techniques that would have been developed in these underground refuges would have emphasized sustainability, efficiency, and working with natural systems rather than against them. Growing food in cave conditions requires understanding of soil chemistry, water management, and plant biology that goes far beyond what is necessary for surface farming. And these communities would have developed expertise in creating productive ecosystems in environments where every resource must be carefully conserved and recycled. The social structures that would have evolved in these underground communities would have been based on cooperation, shared knowledge, and long-term thinking, in ways that surface abundance does not demand. Individual success in cave environments depends absolutely on community success, and communities that could not develop effective systems for resource sharing, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making would not have survived the periods of isolation and resource constraint that underground refuge requires. The technologies that would have been developed by these communities would have focused on durability, repairability, and working with available materials rather than on the planned obsolescence and resource extraction that characterize our current surface-based industrial systems. Tools, structures, and systems designed for underground use must function reliably in conditions where replacement is difficult and failure could be catastrophic, leading to design principles that prioritize functionality and sustainability over novelty and profit. The forms of knowledge preservation that would have been necessary for these communities to maintain their survival capabilities across generations would have emphasized memory techniques, oral traditions, and the integration of practical information with artistic and spiritual practices that make complex information memorable and meaningful. These knowledge systems would have been tested and refined through the ultimate criterion of survival across geological timescales. As we contemplate these possibilities, we begin to see how periods of underground refuge might have served, not as setbacks to human development, but as intensive training periods that developed capabilities, knowledge systems, and social structures that provided the foundation for the rapid civilizational development that occurred when surface conditions stabilized and these underground populations emerged, carrying with them wisdom that had been tested and refined under the most challenging conditions imaginable. When we turn our attention to the psychological dimensions of underground existence, we discover that the metaphor of depth that runs through every tradition of inner exploration may not be merely metaphorical, but rather a direct reflection of actual historical experience that shaped the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. The underground realm appears not just in our dreams and meditations, but in the very structure of how we understand the mind itself, suggesting that our psychological development may mirror our geographical origins. Carl Jung's exploration of the collective unconscious as a vast underground realm where archetypal patterns lie dormant until activated by personal or cultural need, directly parallels the cave systems where these patterns may have been originally developed and tested. His descriptions of the shadow as the dark, hidden aspects of personality that must be integrated for psychological wholeness echo the necessity of learning to navigate in darkness that would have been essential for underground survival, and his emphasis on the importance of descent into the depths before any authentic ascent becomes possible mirrors the mythological patterns of emergence that characterize underground origin stories, the process of individuation that Jung identified as the central task of psychological development involves learning to navigate the complex inner landscape of personal and collective memory, developing the capacity to find meaning and direction in conditions where conventional landmarks are absent, and cultivating the patience and persistence necessary to work with slow, deep processes that operate according to their own rhythms rather than the demands of surface consciousness. These capabilities are precisely those that would have been essential for survival and thriving in underground conditions. Freud's model of the unconscious mind as a cellar beneath the house of everyday awareness, filled with forgotten memories and repressed experiences that continue to influence behavior from hidden depths, may preserve insight into the actual structure of human memory as it developed in cave-dwelling communities where information storage and retrieval would have required sophisticated techniques for organizing knowledge in ways that remained accessible even when separated from the original contexts in which it was acquired. The meditative traditions that have emerged in cultures throughout the world consistently emphasize the importance of inner descent, of learning to find illumination not by reaching toward external light sources, but by discovering the sources of light that exist within consciousness itself. These practices often involve learning to sit comfortably in darkness, to breathe in ways that calm the nervous system, to focus attention inward rather than outward, and to cultivate states of awareness that are independent of external stimulation. All capabilities that would have been essential for psychological survival in underground conditions. The shamanic traditions that form the foundation of healing and spiritual practice in many cultures involve ritualized journeys into underground realms where different forms of knowledge and power can be accessed. These journey practices often include detailed maps of underground territories, specific techniques for navigation in non-ordinary states of consciousness, and methods for bringing back information and capabilities that can be applied to solving problems in ordinary reality, suggesting that these traditions may preserve actual knowledge of underground exploration techniques that were later adapted for psychological and spiritual purposes. The dream traditions that recognize sleep as a time when consciousness naturally descends into deeper levels of reality often describe the dreaming mind as returning to underground realms, where different laws of physics and psychology operate, where communication occurs through symbol and metaphor rather than literal language, and where problems that cannot be solved through surface-level thinking can find resolution through forms of understanding that operate according to the deeper logic of unconscious processes. The artistic and creative traditions that speak of inspiration as something that arises from depths that must be received rather than manufactured, and that often involves periods of apparent emptiness or darkness before new insights emerge, may preserve understanding of the creative processes that would have been essential for underground communities that needed to develop innovative solutions to survival challenges using only the resources and possibilities available in their immediate environment. The therapeutic traditions that recognize healing as fecundizing into the sources of psychological wounding, integration of fragmented aspects of personality, and the cultivation of new relationship between conscious and unconscious processes, mirror the initiation processes that would have been necessary for individuals learning to function effectively in underground communities where surface-based survival strategies would be inadequate, and new forms of competence would need to be developed. As we explore these psychological parallels, we begin to see how the inner landscapes that we navigate through meditation, therapy, creativity, and spiritual practice may not be abstract territories, but rather mental maps of actual geographical territories where human consciousness first learned to function, to adapt, to find meaning and direction in conditions that required forms of awareness and capability that remain essential for psychological development, even in our current surface-based existence. Even in our modern world, we find ourselves drawn again and again to recreate underground conditions, as if some ancient memory guides our choices, toward environments and experiences that reconnect us with capabilities and forms of satisfaction that can only be accessed through descent into depths. Our cities grow not just upward toward the sky, but downward into increasingly elaborate underground networks that serve functions far beyond mere transportation and utility management. The subway systems that form the circulatory networks of our great urban centers create underground environments where millions of people spend significant portions of their daily lives, moving through tunnels that connect not just geographical destinations, but different psychological states, different social encounters, different relationships with time and space than those available on the surface. These systems often develop their own cultures, their own forms of art and music, their own social dynamics that emerge specifically from the unique conditions of underground movement and gathering. The underground shopping centers and pedestrian networks that have developed in cities throughout the world create alternative urban environments that provide protection from weather, different relationships with commercial and social activity, and forms of community gathering that emphasize enclosure, controlled lighting, and acoustic conditions that more closely resemble cave environments than surface plazas and marketplaces. These underground urban spaces often become centers of cultural activity that differ qualitatively from their surface counterparts. The Cold War bunkers and survival shelters that were constructed throughout the mid-20th century represent attempts to create underground communities that could maintain civilizational continuity during periods of surface catastrophe. These projects required developing technologies for life support, food production, communication, and social organization that mirror the challenges that would have faced our cave-dwelling ancestors. And the solutions that were developed often emphasized sustainability, cooperation, and psychological techniques for maintaining health and morale in enclosed conditions. The underground research facilities that house some of our most advanced scientific investigations, from particle accelerators to astronomical observatories, often produce their most significant discoveries in conditions that isolate them from surface interference and create controlled environments where subtle phenomena can be observed and measured. These facilities demonstrate that certain forms of knowledge and capability can only be developed in underground conditions that provide the stability, isolation, and specialized environmental control that cave conditions naturally offer. The wine cellars, cheese caves, and food storage facilities that preserve and enhance agricultural products through controlled underground conditions demonstrate understanding of how the stable temperatures, consistent humidity, and specific bacterial environments available underground can create improvements in quality and preservation that cannot be achieved through surface-based methods. These applications show how underground conditions can enhance rather than merely preserve surface-based production. The meditation retreat centers and spiritual communities that deliberately create cave-like conditions for contemplative practice recognize that certain forms of inner development require environmental conditions that minimize external stimulation and maximize the possibility for deep inward focus. These communities often report that their underground or cave-like practice spaces facilitate forms of awareness and insight that are difficult to access in surface-based environments. The underground music venues and artistic spaces that have developed in cities throughout the world often become centers of cultural innovation, where new forms of expression emerge that take advantage of the acoustic properties, intimate social conditions, and separation from surface commercial pressures that underground environments naturally provide. These spaces frequently become incubators for artistic movements that later influence surface culture. The growing interest in underground homes, earth-sheltered architecture, and building designs that integrate with natural cave formations reflects recognition that underground living offers advantages in energy efficiency, environmental sustainability, and psychological satisfaction that conventional surface-based architecture cannot match. These design approaches often emphasize harmony with natural systems, reduced environmental impact, and forms of beauty that emerged from working with, rather than against, the natural properties of underground spaces. As we observe these modern returns to underground environments, we begin to see them not as regression or escape from progress, but rather as recovery of wisdom and capabilities that our surface-based civilization has temporarily set aside but never completely forgotten. Perhaps our future development as a species involves not choosing between surface and subsurface existence, but learning to integrate the gifts of both realms into forms of civilization that can sustain themselves across geological timescales while supporting the full range of human potential. As we gather together all these threads of myth and science, archaeology and psychology, speculation and direct experience, we find ourselves facing a possibility that transforms not just our understanding of human history, but our vision of human potential. What if our origins truly lie not under the open sky, but within the embracing depths of caverns that served as humanity's first schools, first laboratories, first temples, first homes? If this possibility holds even partial truth, then every step we take on the Earth's surface carries us above the vast network of spaces where human consciousness first learned to recognize itself, where the first tools were crafted, where the first songs were sung, where the first dreams of what humanity might become were first dreamed in the gentle darkness that holds all possibilities within its silent embrace. We walk above our own origins, carrying within our bodies and minds the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who learned to thrive in conditions that required forms of cooperation, creativity, and environmental sensitivity that remain essential for our survival and flourishing today. This understanding changes how we read the archaeological record, transforming isolated cave sites into nodes in a vast network of underground civilization that may have spanned continents and millennia, preserving and developing knowledge systems that provided the foundation for the rapid surface developments that followed the end of the last ice age. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced agricultural techniques, and complex social organizations that seem to appear suddenly in surface civilizations may represent not independent innovations, but rather the emergence and application of wisdom that had been developed and tested over vast periods of time in underground communities. It changes how we understand the persistence of underground imagery in our religious and spiritual traditions, revealing these not as abstract metaphors, but as preserved memories of actual conditions where human consciousness first learned to navigate the depths of inner experience, where practices of meditation, contemplation, and communion with transpersonal forces were developed as survival skills necessary for maintaining psychological and social coherence in conditions that required forms of awareness and capability that surface existence does not demand. It changes how we approach the ecological crises that threaten our current surface-based civilization, offering models of sustainable technology, social organization, and environmental relationship that were developed by communities that could not afford waste, conflict, or ecological destruction. The wisdom preserved in these underground traditions may provide essential guidance for creating forms of civilization that can maintain themselves indefinitely without depleting the resources or destroying the ecosystems that support all life. It changes how we understand human psychology, revealing the inner landscapes we explore through therapy, creativity, and spiritual practice as mental maps of actual territories where human consciousness first learned to function, adapt, and find meaning in conditions that required the development of capabilities that remain essential for psychological health and spiritual development. The techniques for inner navigation that we cultivate through meditation and other contemplative practices may be applications of survival skills that were originally developed for navigation in physical underground environments. It changes how we envision the future of human civilization, suggesting that our destiny may involve not abandoning the earth for the stars, but rather learning to inhabit the earth more completely, developing the technologies and social structures necessary to create sustainable abundance, both on the surface and in the vast underground realms that remain largely unexplored and unutilized. The integration of surface and subsurface capabilities may be essential for creating forms of civilization that can maintain themselves across the geological timescales necessary for true sustainability. Perhaps most fundamentally, it changes how we understand what it means to be human, revealing us as beings uniquely adapted for existence in multiple realms simultaneously, capable of surface achievements and subsurface wisdom, creatures of light and darkness equally, carriers of ancient knowledge and infinite potential, forever poised between the worlds we can see and the worlds that exist beneath every step we take. If our origins lie below, then we are not aliens who have conquered the earth, but rather children of the earth, who are learning to come home to the full range of possibilities that our planetary home offers. This vision invites us to recognize that human civilization is not a project of escaping natural limitations, but rather a process of learning to live in harmony with natural systems at every level of scale and depth, from the microscopic ecosystems that exist within our bodies, to the vast geological processes that shape continents over millions of years. The underground origins hypothesis suggests that we are not separate from nature, but rather nature's way of developing consciousness, intelligence, and creativity that can enhance rather than destroy the ecological relationships that support all life. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond academic questions about human prehistory into practical questions about how we might design our current lives and civilizations to honor and integrate the wisdom that our ancestors developed during their underground period. How might we create educational systems that cultivate the deep listening, environmental sensitivity, and cooperative intelligence that cave dwelling would have required? How might we design our cities and communities to provide the psychological and social benefits of enclosed, intimate spaces, while maintaining connection with the larger ecological systems that support all life? As we stand at this threshold of possibility, we find ourselves invited not to choose between surface and subsurface existence, but rather to learn how to inhabit both realms simultaneously, to be citizens of the upper and lower worlds, to remember that we are beings who carry caverns within our minds and starlight within our dreams, forever connected to both the depths from which we may have emerged and the heights toward which we continue to aspire. In the end, we find ourselves standing at the entrance to a vast cavern where silence holds the memory of humanity's first words, where darkness preserves the light of our original discoveries, where the patient stones remember the first human footsteps that learn to find their way by touch and sound, and the inner illumination that emerges when external light sources are no longer available. Whether this cavern exists in the physical world or in the depths of consciousness matters less than our willingness to enter, to listen, to allow the darkness to teach us what it knows about beginnings, about survival, about the patient work of learning to be human in a universe that is far more mysterious and accommodating than we have allowed ourselves to imagine. The echoes that reach us from these depths are not merely sounds from the past, but invitations to a future where we remember who we truly are, beings shaped by darkness and light equally, creatures of the surface and the depths, carriers of ancient wisdom and infinite possibility, forever connected to the underground realms, where human consciousness first learned to recognize itself in the dancing shadows cast by firelight on ancient walls, where the first dreams of what we might become were dreamed in the gentle darkness that still calls to us from beneath our feet, waiting in the eternal silence for us to remember that home was never only above, but always, forever, also below. The journey we have taken together through these depths of possibility leaves us changed, carrying within ourselves new understanding of the caverns that exist not only beneath the earth, but within the landscape of human consciousness itself. We return to the surface world, bearing gifts that can only be received in darkness, wisdom that can only be learned through descent, capabilities that can only be developed through sustained relationship with the depths that cradle all emergence and hold all return as the silence settles around us, like the gentle darkness of a cave at rest. We find ourselves no longer walking merely on the surface of the earth, but walking simultaneously above and within the vast network of chambers and passages where the story of human consciousness first began to unfold, where it continues to unfold, and where it will always find refuge when the surface world becomes too bright, too loud, too fast for the deeper forms of wisdom that can only flourish in the patient, eternal embrace of the underground realm that remains forever our most ancient and most enduring home.